Angeles. It's the largest Iranian diaspora in the US. So it was just one of those moments where you could gather and enjoy. It was sort of a stark contrast, though, to what people were seeing outside the stadium yesterday, because there were a lot of Iranians who showed up to protest.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yasmin Vasugian. So there's mixed feelings amongst Iranian Americans watching their team tie New Zealand in the World Cup. We're going to talk about how politics is playing a role in the World Cup games, plus how the FBI foiled a planned attack on the White House UFC fight, and why the president says he didn't know anything about it. Up first, though, President Trump told European leaders at the G7 summit that he is ready to move on from Iran and turn his attention to the war in Ukraine.
So now that this is finished, we're going to be focusing on that, see if we can get that one done. 25,000 people a month are dying.
Now, that would be good news for Europe. They have been hoping the United States would help restart talks with Russia. But then a little bit later on, President Trump seemed to step away from that messaging, saying that the U.S. had, quote, nothing to do with Ukraine.
It has no impact on us other than we sell weapons. We're thousands of miles away.
Yet Trump also met with Ukrainian President Zelensky on the sidelines of the G7 summit. So what are we expecting to come out of the G7? And does Europe really believe that Iran is no longer an issue? Those are the questions I have for NBC News Chief White House correspondent Garrett Haake, who is traveling with the president in Geneva. Hi, Garrett.
Hello. Bonjour.
Bonjour to you. I want to talk about the vibes here because it was at this time last year in which the president left abruptly the G7 summit to launch Operation Midnight Hammer on Iran. What is it looking like this time around?
So far, much better, but that is a low bar. I was talking to a person close to the president earlier today who said that the president hated that summit in Alberta. He thought the meetings were all BS. He just didn't want to be there. He doesn't like these kind of multilateral events anyway. He would much prefer to meet with leaders one-on-one. He kind of, disdains this sort of clubby things. But this event has been sort of designed to cater to him. They pushed the start date back a day to accommodate his UFC fight at the White House on Sunday night. Emmanuel Macron, the French president who's the host, has invited President Trump to dinner at Versailles the day this summit concludes, sort of like a little extra carrot to keep him around till the end. The president talked about that today. He has decent relationships with most of these leaders, all of them strained by the war in Iran. And with that sort of less of a talking point than it probably would have been a week ago, I think it's the vibes are better than they would have been a week ago. But I think there's definitely a sense, particularly among the European leaders, that they're kind of walking on eggshells here a little bit around Trump, knowing that these kinds of things can turn south very quickly with him.
Okay, so with that, because I know the president probably wanted to show up to the G7 and take a victory lap, having negotiated a quote-unquote end to this war. And I'm saying quote-unquote because we don't necessarily know if it's really going to end. And nothing has been signed yet. I know there's been an electronic signing, but they're going to have an official signing on Friday of this memorandum and then negotiate for the next 60 days. The president is going to need the European allies to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And he has repeatedly said that he wants Iran to be behind him, but that's difficult when it's still ongoing and nothing is finalized. How are the European allies, how are folks at the G7, how are they responding to the framework of this Iran-U.S. memorandum / potential deal?
Well, a couple points on that. First, the idea this has been signed virtually is also interesting to me just because of how, vicious Trump has been towards President Biden and the idea of using an auto pen. Here, they've essentially did even less than that. They basically docu-signed this MOU in advance of the actual signing. The way we do our taxes. On Friday. Yeah, exactly right. And so there's a certain element of hypocrisy there given the attacks. Secondly, the White House doesn't think they need the European allies to really help reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The theory had been that they would need them or could use their help in sweeping for mines. But as our colleague Courtney Kube reported, no mines have actually been found yet. And so while that effort is ongoing, it's possible that it will turn up nothing fairly quickly. And there is already some ship traffic moving through the strait. Overall, the leaders that we've heard from on this topic have been pretty complimentary of the president for the way that he's ended this conflict. They were very unhappy with the way he started it and pretty unhappy with the way that he managed it throughout. But at least at the end, they seem to be reasonably happy with the place that it's landed. And where I think there might be a bigger role for Europe in particular is in the negotiations here at the end with Iran about sort of what any reintegration with them into the global economy looks like. And the reason I say that is because they've already done this once, and that was in the form of the JCPOA. The original agreement with Iran negotiated during the Obama administration was negotiated in large part with a group of European partners. And so it's possible they step up here. There's already a similar role being played by some of the Gulf Arab countries. Qatar and the UAE and others have fronted some of the money that might be available to Iran to rebuild if they follow the rules of this MOU, at least the way that it's been described by U.S. officials. And so there are like little green shoots of a coalition here, but we'll see how much, if at all, they grow into anything over the next couple of weeks.
So if, in fact, the president is able to put Iran behind him, if even temporarily, then does the focus shift back to Ukraine? I certainly imagine that President Zelensky is hoping so. And the president had hinted on Monday that he is now ready to help bring the war between Ukraine and Russia to an end. And then, as I played earlier, today he seems a little bit less enthusiastic about that. At the same time, he hinted at possibly resuming U.S. sanctions on Russian oil, which had been temporarily lifted to bring down energy prices during the Iran war. There has been some meetings that have been ongoing, some behind closed doors at the G7 about Ukraine. What do we know?
Yeah, President Zelensky is here as a guest of the G7. He did not have a meeting with President Trump on the books when he showed up, and it sounds like before today's over, he's going to have two of them. We've confirmed one private meeting between Trump, Macron, and Zelensky that happened behind closed doors. Then Zelensky spoke with the whole of the G7, and the president said he intended to talk to Zelensky again. So those conversations, if productive, could be useful towards bringing the war to a close. But the reality is, Yasmin, the president spent much of his first year in office focused, at least to some extent, on trying to end that war, and they got nowhere. We were in Alaska, for crying out loud, for a summit with Vladimir Putin that produced absolutely nothing. And so I think the European allies and Zelensky would welcome the president's renewed engagement. They would certainly welcome more weapons being sold or provided to Ukraine. Whether the president has the magic touch here to somehow make Vladimir Putin negotiate has been asked and answered, at least up until this point. Now, if the president decides he really wants to ratchet up the pressure on Putin, maybe that could make a difference. The battlefield has certainly changed in the last, since the last time this was on the president's front burner. Ukraine's really turned things around, according to most accounts. So they've been taking back more land that they've been losing. They've been striking deeper into Russian territory. So maybe the facts on the ground make it possible for the president's involvement to substantively change the direction that that war is going. But that wasn't the case when he was more engaged earlier. So, my own kind of analysis of this is my expectations for the president to kind of swoop in and bring that war to a close are low. But U.S. engagement, I think the working theory certainly here would be welcome and could be helpful.
What else are you watching this week at the G7?
Well, the actual economic elements of this summit could be interesting. They're supposed to be talking about AI. They're supposed to be talking about critical minerals. Europe, to a lesser degree than the United States, but similarly got caught completely flat-footed on critical minerals, and all of a sudden, the whole economy involves around your ability to build more chips and build more batteries, and everybody needs China for that. The Chinese are not in the room, so do these wealthy democracies come up with an actual plan on this while they're sitting here, or is it just a book club where they talk about it and they don't actually get anywhere? I think long-term, that could be an interesting thing to watch that comes out of this for sure.
Garrett Haake, thank you.
You bet.
So on Sunday, more than 4,000 people came together on the White House lawn for a UFC cage match to celebrate President Trump's 80th birthday. Rain and strong winds delayed the start of the event by an hour. But this morning, we found out that the fights could have been disrupted by a much more dangerous threat. FBI Director Patel wrote in a post on X that a few days before the fight, law enforcement discovered that there was a potential threat targeting the event. Patel also said that multiple people had already been placed in custody. So what do we know about this alleged plot, including who was behind it and why they wanted to do it? For this, I want to bring in Ryan J. Reilly, justice reporter for NBC News. Hey, Ryan.
Hey there.
What details do we have on this?
Yeah, so some of the details are still trickling out. We're actually sorting through a lot of these FBI affidavits right now to figure out what this is all about. But preliminarily, what we have seen is that this was all organized via TikTok. There were some people who were following one another, and then they jumped over to Signal, which is that encrypted app that a lot of journalists, a lot of folks use these days to keep their communications more secure. And that's where this plot allegedly sort of all unfolded. The way that this sort of got busted was that an individual, a 19-year-old, his mother sort of overheard him or oversaw him making some of these plans. He was apparently, looking to map out locations, and they sort of talked to the authorities about how he had gotten sucked into some of these more religiously themed and sort of extremist organizations. And so we're still learning a lot, I think, about how this was exactly shut down, but there were some emergency disclosures that law enforcement authorities asked for. They went to these companies and asked for information on some of their users to try to determine who these individuals were. And so this wasn't one of those plots that you often hear about where the FBI was in on it the entire time, that they had an informant inside. From the appearance of this case and what we've learned about it thus far, it appears that this was, a sort of a plot that was already developing at some point when the FBI and law enforcement was informed.
So what were their alleged plans?
There was talk of using drones and explosives and bringing in gunmen. One of the interesting things that I was just looking at was there was talk of these 4 different levels, right? So this sort of tier 1 level where people who are expected to get caught or make sacrifices. Then there were various levels down, including then, to tier 4, which would just be sort of social media influencers, trying to gin up more material on this, and essentially what they were trying to do, according to federal authorities, was set off some sort of mass event in the United States to inspire people to sort of stand up against the government. I think there was a lot of talk about the Epstein files and elites. There was a lot of concern over the Iran war, a lot of concern over the influence of Israel, and so I think that's sort of the core grievances that this group had. But we're still sort of learning a little bit more about it. It does seem to have this sort of Christian emphasis, and talking about the old order is one of the phrases that they referred to here.
You mentioned one of the ways in which they identified these individuals was because of a mother who identified her son, who is now an alleged suspect. Who are these people that are currently allegedly in custody?
Yeah, they're sort of spread out across the country. We don't know all of the names yet. We're learning, affidavit by affidavit as they come in. But I think one of the interesting backgrounds things here is that I think we'll find out about in the coming days is there was definitely some behind the scenes aggravation around how this news sort of came out originally, because it came out in this Fox News digital piece that didn't have a lot of details about what was actually happening here, and then Kash Patel's post. And of course, the background of this is that Kash Patel does appear to be in a tough spot within the administration right now, and there's been a lot of questions about how long he'll remain in that spot. And so that's, I think, a lot of the background that's been feeding into this.
Do we know why it is that the president said he didn't know of this? Is that unusual?
That is a great question, right? Because that's sort of the thing that you normally, when you're sort of you're trying to impress your boss, that's something that is communicated to the boss, and there doesn't appear to.
You would think the FBI director would have informed the president of the United States before posting it on social media on X and saying they foiled this plot.
Precisely, yes. Especially such an important event to the president, something, but obviously the president's been very busy. So we don't know what those lines of communication precisely are, but there has been all of this reporting around Kash Patel's relationship with Trump and relationship with the White House, and questions surrounding his performance as FBI director.
What is next in this investigation?
I think throughout the day, in the coming days, we're going to find out more from these affidavits. We can see potentially more arrests. I think the question is, did the way that this news broke did that have any material impact on this law enforcement investigation? Did it create any complications down the line? Did it allow people to delete materials before they were taken into custody because they saw the news around this? And so I think those are the questions that remain at this point, and whether or not they're going to be able to capture everyone who is actually allegedly involved in this, or whether people are going to be able to flee, because this was clearly a very well, sort of coordinated takedown, but there were some hiccups along the way, it appears.
So to be clear, they feel as if not everybody has been taken into custody that is involved in this alleged plot.
Certainly, there's no public indications that everyone has been taken into custody. And I think the statement from the Secret Service and some of the material that the Secret Service put out about this is really revealing, because you essentially had the Secret Service saying that, the importance here is making sure that we can execute on getting justice in the end, right? So they essentially were saying, hey, listen, it's not the initial, media surge that matters. It's making sure that justice is ultimately served in the end, meaning that these cases are adjudicated properly and we're not doing anything to impact those few cases in the future. And that's sort of been an ongoing theme, I would say, throughout this, in this era of the FBI, sort of, jumping the gun a little bit on cases and not necessarily putting as much priority as a lot of law enforcement professionals would tell me that, should be put into the ultimate outcome of the cases and making sure that you're not doing anything to mess up cases down the line, rather than that initial sort of flash in the pan of being able to, post on X, for example.
Ryan Reilly, thank you.
Thanks so much.
So there are a lot of games to watch in this World Cup, but I'm Iranian American. You guys know this by now. And I felt like I wanted to watch the Iran-New Zealand game last night with my family. There has been so much drama in the lead up to this moment for them. Would they come? Would they not come? They changed their home location from Arizona to Mexico, citing security concerns. Some of their players and much of the support staff were unable to join. And all of this is because, of course, of the war, which coincidentally this week may be finally ending. Keyword there, may. But last night, the stadium was filled with Iranian fans. So I wanted to get a sense of how Iranian fans overall are feeling during a very confusing time. For this, I want to bring in NBC News culture and trends editor Saba Hamedy, who was at a watch party in Los Angeles, as they like to call it there, Tehrangeles. And she is with me now. And that is because there are just so many Iranians that populate that area. Hi, Saba.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's great to have you. It must have been incredible to be at that watch party with so many Iranians watching this thing. What were they telling you? How did they feel about rooting for the Iranian soccer team?
Yeah, I mean, I think the watch party, the vibes were very, very positive and excited, because a lot of the people I spoke with were saying that they love supporting their homeland, and they were able to personally not associate the team with the regime. That was sort of the feeling I got from the folks who I spoke with at this event. And, they were just excited to celebrate as a community. As you mentioned, Tehrangeles, it's the largest Iranian diaspora in the US. So it was just one of those moments where you could gather and enjoy. It was sort of a stark contrast, though, to what people were seeing outside the stadium yesterday, because there were a lot of Iranians who showed up to protest. And that was because they feel the Team Melli, the national team, doesn't represent them and the people. It represents the regime. That's their argument. Some of them were even calling on FIFA to expel the team. But I spoke with two sisters named Parveen and Parvoneh.
Classic Iranian names.
Classic. And they were in their 70s and they were true characters. Parveen was telling me that she really was there because she believes in, the young people of Iran, and she was just sitting there picturing the thousands of kids in Iran at home and on their TVs watching their team. But it was funny because her sister, Parvoneh, offered a different take. Parvoneh as the Iranian flag, not the lion and sun flag, which is associated with the pre-regime, but the current Islamic Republic of Iran flag, as that was being shown on camera because it was the start of the game. She said to me, it gives me chills because that's not my flag.
There was actually controversy around the flag in being able to carry the Shah's flag, which was the regime prior to the current government, versus the Islamic Republic flag.
Right off the bat, ahead of the World Cup, FIFA said that they will not allow the non-current flag in the stadiums. And they said it's because it violates their policy for bringing in anything that like is political or offensive. However, Iranian people tried to fight that, arguing free speech. They were saying FIFA can't limit free speech. And they actually, in Los Angeles, had filed a lawsuit last week requesting that a judge stop the ban. On Monday, last minute, yesterday, before the game, the judge upheld the ban. So a bunch of Iranians were mad, but they still snuck in their flags.
You know, as I was watching the game last night with my family, I thought a lot about how these players weren't able to necessarily train properly because war was happening. They couldn't leave their country, right? They probably were able to only scrimmage with themselves. And when they were scrimmaging, they were likely scrimmaging with, you know, bombs flying overhead at times in the early days of this war. So you think about kind of the impact of that moment and what they were carrying as they took to the field yesterday against New Zealand. And it was an incredible game to watch.
For sure. And I can't imagine what it was like for them in terms of the whirlwind beforehand, not just the war, but the fact that last minute their training camp got moved from the States
from
to
Arizona
Tijuana
to Mexico. Right.
You know, and the coach last night after the game told reporters that they're being asked to leave like right after the game. So it seems like they didn't even hotel in the States.
Yeah. And we did hear from a spokesperson for DHS who said the Iranian national football team agreed to these terms, that in fact they would be leaving after every game. I believe they're allowed to come to, for instance, Los Angeles the day before the game, but they must leave directly after the game. Did the fans tell you they're going to continue watching no matter what?
Oh, yeah. The people I spoke with were really excited. And obviously the game, as you said, was really fun to watch. It was a tie 2-2. And every time there was a goal, they were screaming and chanting and cheering. And yeah, it was just great.
Thank you, Saba.
Thanks for having me.
All right. That is going to do it for us at Here's the Scoop from NBC News. I'm Yazmin Basugan. We'll be back tomorrow with whatever the day may bring. And if you like what you heard and you saw, press the subscribe button. We'll see you tomorrow.
We thank you for watching. And remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.